All right, ready to dive into the world of constitutions.
Always up for a good Constitution deep dive.
Today, we're going global, exploring how these documents, these like rule books for nations, shape societies.
It's fascinating how one document can impact so much, from individual rights to how a whole government works.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing. And we've got a ton of research to dig through academic papers, a UN report on constitutions changing over time, even some stuff on Chile's constitution.
Sounds like a lot to unpack.
It is. But before we go globetrotting, let's start basic. What is a constitution?
You'd be surprised how often that gets overlooked. At their heart, constitutions are the blueprints for how a country runs. They define a nation's values, citizens' rights, and how the government should function. Think of them like instruction manuals.
Okay, so like an instruction manual, some are more detailed than others.
Exactly. Some are super specific, like a giant legal dictionary, while others are more like sets of guiding principles.
So like, here's the general idea, now go figure out the details.
Pretty much. Take the U.S. Constitution. It's famously concise, lays out the big ideas, but leaves room for interpretation as times change.
Smart move, those founding fathers, keeping it open for updates like some early version of software.
Right. Then you've got the opposite, like China's constitution.
Way more detailed.
Much more. It dives into specifics on a whole range of issues. Their goal is clear direction, leaving less wiggle room in how things run.
Two very different approaches. So it's not just having a constitution, is what kind you have, and how that reflects, well, the soul of a nation.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Now, how do these constitutions even come about? Is it always some big revolution, a dramatic moment?
Not always, but sometimes, yeah. This UN report has some wild stories, like the Septima Papaleta movement in Colombia back in the 90s.
What's that, seventh ballot or something?
Yeah. It was a student-led movement demanding a new constitution. They basically forced a referendum by adding an extra ballot to the election.
Wait, seriously, just snuck in a whole extra question? Bold move.
It worked. This seventh ballot made the government face the need for change. Eventually, they got a new constitution in 1991.
People power. That's so different from how some constitutions come about, you know, after a war or something.
Right. And it highlights how diverse these processes are, from top-down mandates to, believe it or not, crowdsourcing.
Crowdsourcing a constitution? What, like an online suggestion box for rewriting the laws of the land?
That's exactly what Iceland did. Back in 2010, they used a digital platform to rewrite theirs, letting citizens give feedback and ideas.
Wow, hold on. So they really let anyone chime in on their constitution. Did that actually work? What were the challenges?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. So Iceland, huh? A digital democracy experiment for their constitution. Super ambitious.
Sounds like it. Did it work? What were the pros and cons?
It was a mixed bag, to be honest. On one hand, you have this amazing level of citizen engagement, thousands of people giving input. Some of their ideas even made it into the final draft.
That's what I find so interesting. It challenges the idea that constitutions are these, like, sacred texts written by a select few and never touched again. This was a dynamic process involving a whole nation.
You got it. But of course, there were challenges. For one, how do you make sure the process, while open to all, doesn't get hijacked by fringe opinions or dominated by, say, the most tech-savvy citizens?
Right, because not everyone's glued to a computer screen ready to debate constitutional law.
Exactly. So they had this balancing act, keeping it open and participatory, but also making sure the final product was coherent and, actually reflected a range of viewpoints.
So walking a tightrope between pure democracy and making sure the Constitution is still, well, a constitution?
A good way to put it.
Yeah.
Did they manage? For the most part, yes.
Yeah.
The 2012 draft, it wasn't adopted in the end. Politics got complicated.
Ah, the messy world of politics strikes again.
Right. But the process itself, groundbreaking. It showed the world that digital tools, they can make these processes way more transparent, way more inclusive.
Even if they didn't get the new constitution they set out for, they pioneered a new way of thinking about these things.
Totally. And it speaks to a larger point, whether it's Colombian students with their seventh ballot or Iceland going digital. There's this hunger for people to have a say in how their countries are run.
It's not just about the rules, it's who gets to make them, change them. Speaking of, we haven't forgotten about Chile. They've had their own constitutional journey, right?
Oh, absolutely. Chile is a fascinating case study. Their current constitution, the one from 1980, born out of a very different era.
Right, under a military regime, wasn't it?
Yeah. So they've been dealing with this legacy, figuring out how to move from authoritarianism to a more democratic system. Their constitution's a big part of that.
So how have they been navigating that? It's not like you can just erase history and start over.
Nope, it's been gradual. Lots of reforms along the way. Like in 2005, they amended the Constitution to reduce the influence of unelected senators,
Hmm.
shifted power towards a more democratically elected body.
So slowly dismantling those authoritarian leftovers built into the system. What other big reform areas have they tackled?
One of the big ones, the role of the state in things like healthcare and education, the 80 Constitution, it emphasized individual liberty, free markets. Didn't initially prioritize social rights as much as some people wanted.
Ah, the classic tension between individual freedom and social safety nets. It's a debate happening everywhere. Finding that balance is tough.
Tell me about it. And in Chile, there's been this push to put more emphasis on social rights in the Constitution, reflecting how their values are changing.
So it's not just about what the Constitution said back then, but what it should say now to reflect the people.
Right. But it's been messy, lots of back and forth. Different political groups, they have different ideas about what the government should be responsible for.
Sounds like the debate's far from over, but it brings up another point. We've been focusing on the process, the making, the changing. But what about the actual content? What makes these documents so powerful?
Great question. At the core of any constitution, you'll find the protection of fundamental rights. These are the basic freedoms everyone's supposed to have, no matter who's in charge.
Like freedom of speech, religion, right to a fair trial, those cornerstones?
Exactly. Meant to be safeguards against tyranny. They make sure individuals have the means to live with dignity, with autonomy. And what's fascinating is that what we consider fundamental rights, it's evolved.
Evolved? How so? Now you got me curious.
Well, a lot of early constitutions, they focused on civil and political rights. Things like voting, free speech, protection from being arbitrarily arrested. But over time, there's been this realization that true equality, true freedom, requires more than that.
So it's not enough to just have a voice. You also need the means to actually live a decent life.
Exactly. And that's where social and economic rights come in. Things like the right to education, healthcare, housing, even a clean environment. Things that impact your material well-being.
It's like saying freedom's great, but you need a roof over your head and food on the table to actually enjoy it.
Right. It's about recognizing that the government has a role to play in ensuring a certain standard of living, not just leaving people to fend for themselves.
So have these social and economic rights made their way into constitutions globally?
They have. And more, it reflects a shift in how we think about government. It's not just about protecting us from something, but also ensuring we have the means to thrive.
A more holistic view of what a just society really means.
Exactly. To see this in action, we could look at how different countries have put these rights into practice. Take South Africa. They came out of apartheid, right? And they created this constitution that's like a shining example of how to make things right.
Yeah, apartheid, that had to have a huge impact on how they thought about equality and justice when writing their constitution.
Absolutely. Their constitution, it's not just talking about equality on paper. It recognizes the need to fix past wrongs, to support disadvantaged groups, to really protect minority rights.
So it's about action, not just words. Building a fairer future by acknowledging the past. Powerful stuff.
It really is. And while South Africa's story is unique, it shows this trend. Constitutions grappling with social and economic imbalances. Another interesting case, Bolivia.
What's different about Bolivia?
Their 2009 constitution. It's amazing how it deals with indigenous rights, environmental protection, really weaving it all together.
So they're taking these big principles and applying them to their specific context, their values.
Exactly. They have a strong indigenous culture, and they're facing serious environmental challenges. So they put those front and center in their constitution. It recognizes indigenous communities' right to self-determination, their land, their resources, and it stresses sustainability, protecting their incredible biodiversity.
It's like each country is coming up with its own recipe for a just society, using its own unique ingredients, its own story.
That is the perfect way to put it. And it brings us back to something we've been talking about all along. There's no single blueprint for a good constitution. Every nation's journey is different, shaped by its history, its culture, the challenges it's faced.
It's been eye-opening to see just how diverse these approaches are. From bare bones to super detailed, from student protests to online forums, it shows how much creativity goes into deciding how a society should run itself.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying constitutions so fascinating. These documents, they're not dusty old relics. They're alive. They reflect the energy of the societies they govern.
They can be tools for change, shields against oppression, even roadmaps to a better future. Who knew constitutions could be so, well, dynamic?
You said it. And that's why it's so important to understand them, their history, their strengths, their weaknesses. Because in the end, a constitution's only as good as the people who believe in it, the values it represents.
So true. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of what a constitution is to how different countries around the world have approached creating and changing theirs.
We've seen revolutions, negotiations, even technology all play a role in shaping these powerful documents.
And we've seen how they can protect individuals, promote fairness, and even help us tackle global issues like climate change. It's a lot to think about.
It is. And on that note, I think it's time to hand it over to our listeners.
Yes, we've talked a lot about how people can be a driving force for change, whether it's through movements, voting, or even going online to share their ideas. So here's a question for everyone at home. When it comes to shaping a constitution, what do you think the balance should be between everyday citizens and elected officials? It's a tough one. How do you make sure everyone's voice is heard while also making sure there's, careful thought and expertise involved, something to chew on as you continue your own deep dive into the world of constitutions?
Such a crucial question, and I think the answer is going to be different everywhere. It all comes down to a society's values, its unique situation.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for joining us for this global exploration of constitutions. We hope you've learned something new, maybe even seen these documents in a whole new light. Until next time, stay curious.